Sometime around 5:15 in the morning on June 6th, 1944, a German artillery major in his early 30s raised his binoculars over the English Channel. He had done this 1,000 times before. 4 years of empty water, 4 years of the same gray horizon, the same firing tables, the same silence. This morning, the horizon was gone. In its place stood ships, thousands of them. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft moving with a calm that suggested they had been waiting there for hours. His mind refused what his eyes were reporting. He picked up the telephone in his concrete bunker above what the Americans would soon name Omaha Beach, and he called his division headquarters. The voice on the other end told him it was impossible. There were not that many ships in the world. Nobody had that many ships. 60 miles across that same gray water, your father, or the man your mother would later marry, or the boy who grew up 2 houses down and never came home, was sitting in the belly of a landing craft with a rifle between his knees. He did not know that the man on the bluff above the beach he was heading for had already tried to warn Berlin. He did not know that Berlin had refused to listen. He did not know that the most important battle of his generation had, in a very real sense, already been decided. Not by the guns that were about to open up on him, not by the sea that was about to try to drown him, by a single telephone call answered in the wrong tone of voice in a command post 600 miles behind the beach, hours before his boots ever touched the sand. This is what happened on the German end of that telephone line. His name was Werner Pluskat. He was in his early 30s, a career artillery officer, and by the standards of the German army in 1944, he had been lucky. Lucky to hold the rank of major. Lucky to command the 1st Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment. Lucky most of all to be here in Normandy, on the coast of France, and not on the frozen Eastern Front, where the cadre of veteran officers and non-commissioned officers that gave his division its backbone had earned their scars the hard way. His command post was a concrete observation bunker at Weiderstandsnest 59, dug into the bluffs above the small French village of Saint-Honoré-des-Pertes. Behind him lay a 900-year-old country of hedgerows and dairy farms. In front of him lay the English Channel. And beyond that, on the far side of that gray water, waited an enemy that everyone in the German High Command had spent months preparing to meet somewhere else entirely. Not here. Not on this stretch of Normandy Beach. Pluskat had spent 4 years scanning this same horizon. His men called it the loneliest posting in France. Every morning, the same duty. Every night, the same routine. Firing solutions calculated and recalculated for targets that never came. Radio watches kept for messages that never arrived. A war fought entirely against the possibility of another war, one that his superiors kept telling him would never actually begin here. He was not the man who would decide the fate of the invasion, but he would be the first to see it. Above him, the German command structure in the west stretched upward through a chain of names that would each in their own way fail on the morning of June 6th. And to understand what happened in his bunker at dawn, you have to understand the men who sat above him, because the tragedy of Werner Pluskat is not that he saw the fleet. The tragedy is that he saw it, and nobody listened. Commander of Army Group B, the formation directly responsible for defending the Norman coast, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. 52 years old, slight of build, legendary, the Desert Fox. The man whose Africa Corps had spent 2 years running rings around the British in the deserts of North Africa before being ground down by overwhelming Allied material and Allied air power. He carried that memory into France like a scar. He had watched what Allied fighter bombers did to armored columns caught in the open. He had watched entire divisions burn on desert roads because they had no sky above them to protect them. And when Hitler sent him to France in late 1943 to inspect the West's defenses, he arrived with a single conviction burned into him by direct personal experience. The invasion had to be stopped on the beach, not miles inland, not in some grand mobile counterattack. On the beach, In the first hours, before the fleet unloaded, before the air umbrella settled in, before there was a beachhead to counterattack at all, Rommel had a phrase for this. He said it more than once to his aides that spring of 1944. The first 24 hours of the invasion, he said, would be decisive. For the Allies as much as for us. He called it the longest day, and he meant it as a warning. Above Rommel stood his own superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, 68 years old Prussian aristocracy, a man who had been fighting wars since before Rommel was old enough to shave. Rundstedt looked at Hitler with the barely concealed contempt of a professional soldier forced to serve an amateur, and he disagreed with Rommel about almost everything. Rundstedt wanted the panzer divisions held deep inland. Let the Allies land. Let them commit. Let them reveal their true intentions. Then, and only then, strike with one massed armored counterattack that would drive them back into the sea. It was a doctrine that had worked in 1940. It was a doctrine that assumed a battlefield where the German army could still move in daylight. Neither man got what he wanted. Hitler, sitting at his mountain retreat at the Berghof above Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, refused to choose. He split the difference in a way that locked Germany's strongest armored reserve behind his own personal signature, and his alone. We will come back to what that meant. Because on the night of June 5th, that one man was going to take his usual sedative and go to sleep. Between Berlin and the Norman coast ran a chain of intelligence officers, most of them convinced that the real invasion, when it came, would come at the Pas-de-Calais, more than 100 miles to the northeast, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Their reasoning was sound. It was the shortest crossing. It was closest to the ports the Allies would need to sustain a campaign. It was the most direct route into the industrial heart of Germany. There was only one problem with their reasoning. It was exactly what the Allies wanted them to think. But there was one officer in that intelligence chain who had earned the right to be listened to. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer. He served as the senior intelligence officer of the 15th Army, headquartered near the Pas-de-Calais, and for months he had been running one of the quiet successes of German counterintelligence. His radio interception team had broken the code the British were using to signal the French resistance. He knew what phrases to listen for. He knew what they meant. He was, in his small, quiet way, one of the few men in the entire German command structure who was going to do his job correctly on the night of June 5th. And it would not matter at all. Down on the coast itself, at the sharp end of the chain, sat a man who deserves to be remembered more than he ever has been. General Erich Marx, commanding officer of the 84th Army Corps. On June 6, 1944, Marx would turn 53 years old. He walked with a wooden prosthetic. Soviet artillery had taken his real leg near Ukraine in June of 1941 during the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Same war had taken 2 of his 3 sons, killed in the fighting on the Eastern Front in the years that followed. He was not a good man in any clean moral sense. He had helped author the first operational draft of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the plan that became Barbarossa itself, the plan that killed millions of people, including his own children. He served a criminal regime. He knew what that regime was doing. He kept serving anyway. But by the assessment of the officers who worked under him, Marx was among the sharpest military minds left in the German order of battle. And he was one of the very few senior commanders on the Western Front who had looked at the maps that spring, weighed the evidence, and concluded, against the consensus of nearly everyone above him, that the Allies were not coming to Calais, they were coming to Normandy. He had said so. Repeatedly, he had been politely ignored. His command post sat in a chateau north of the town of Saint-Lô. On the morning of June 6th, he would be one of the first senior German officers to react to the invasion with the speed the situation demanded. He would order the 21st Panzer Division into motion. He would try. And 6 days later, on the 12th of June, An Allied fighter bomber would spot his staff car on a Norman road near a village called Hebecravon, and a 20-millimeter round would sever his femoral artery, and he would bleed to death in a roadside ditch by mid-morning. His 53rd birthday would be the last one he ever celebrated. Somewhere in the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, at that same moment, young German soldiers of the 716th Infantry Division, the understrength garrison unit that everyone still believed was the only German formation, guarding the bluffs above the beach the Americans would call Omaha, were writing letters home to their mothers. Their letters were not heroic. They were honest. They wrote about the concrete that had not arrived, about the guns that pointed the wrong way, about the propaganda posters that told German civilians back home about an impregnable wall that they could see with their own eyes was nothing of the kind. Many of them would be dead within 48 hours of the invasion beginning. And here is the twist that shapes everything that follows. Because those men in the bunkers and the American planners who were about to send troops against their positions, and the entire Allied intelligence apparatus that had spent months mapping the German order of battle along this coast, all shared the same critical mistake. All believed that the 716th was the only German formation defending Omaha Beach. It was not. In March of 1944, without fanfare, under strict radio silence, the 352nd Infantry Division had moved quietly into the interior behind those beaches. It was a full-strength formation. It had been built around veteran officers and non-commissioned officers pulled off the Eastern Front, men who had survived the worst fighting of the Soviet campaign, men who knew what real combat looked like. It had spent weeks running live tactical exercises across the exact terrain the Americans were about to assault. Its guns had been pre-registered to cover essentially every meter of the beach below, and it appeared on not a single Allied intelligence map that reached the divisional commanders who were about to land against it. There are stories about why. Old stories passed down in the folklore of the campaign. Stories about a French resistance carrier pigeon shot down by a German soldier somewhere over the Norman countryside, carrying a message bound for London. Stories that would explain the whole thing in one tidy piece of bad luck. But those stories are not confirmed by the serious historical record. Truer, harder answer is that Allied strategic intelligence at Bletchley Park had picked up hints of the division's movement. But the information never made it down through the chain, never reached the operational maps in the hands of the officers of the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions who were about to wade ashore. Not a pigeon, a bureaucracy. The American soldiers who were about to land at Omaha Beach believed they were about to fight an understrength garrison of older men and conscripted Eastern European volunteers. They were about to meet combat veterans instead. And the men in the bunkers above the beach, Werner Pluskat's own artillery battalion among them, had no idea that their own high command had failed just as completely as the Allies had, only in the opposite direction. They did not know that the fleet forming on the horizon represented something their own headquarters had already, months earlier, dismissed as physically impossible. To understand what happened on the morning of June 6th, you have to understand the ground. You have to see it the way the German gunners saw it, standing behind their pre-registered artillery pieces in the pale summer light. You have to see it the way Erwin Rommel saw it, walking the bluffs in his greatcoat in the spring of 1944, driving a walking stick into the wet sand and calculating how many mines it would take to fill the tidal flat below. You have to see it the way an American infantryman would see it, less than 6 weeks from now, wading through chest-deep water with 60 pounds of equipment on his back and machine gun fire cracking overhead. The Normandy coast runs for roughly 80 kilometers between the town of St. Mary-Glaces in the west and the mouth of the Orne River in the east. 50 miles of dairy country, apple orchards, and stone farmhouses that had stood there since before the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Behind the beaches lay the bocage, A landscape of small fields separated by ancient hedgerows built up over centuries into walls of earth and rooted vegetation 10 feet high and just as thick. Tank country in name only. In practice, some of the most brutal defensive terrain in Western Europe. The Allies had divided the invasion coast into 5 sectors. Utah in the west at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, then Omaha, then Gold, then Juneau, then Sword in the east, opposite the small city of Caen. Of those 5, one was different from the others. Omaha. Omaha was different because of the ground. The beach itself was a crescent of pale sand, roughly 6 kilometers long. At low tide, that sand stretched 300 yards from the waterline to the seawall. 300 yards of open ground with no cover, no dunes, no brush. Nothing between a landing soldier and the guns above. And above the beach rose the bluffs. Not gentle slopes, cliffs, in some places 30 meters high. Steep enough that a man could climb them, but only slowly, only exposed, only under fire. And cut into those bluffs at 4 points along the beach were the only ways off. The Americans would call them draws. Small valleys running back into the interior. Every one of them zeroed by German artillery. Every one of them covered by machine gun positions. Every one of them a killing funnel. Werner Pluskat's observation post at Widerstandsnest 59 sat above the eastern end of that beach, near the village of Saint-Honorine-des-Perts. From there, on a clear morning, he could see the whole crescent of Omaha spread out below him. He could see the sand. He could see the water. He could see the horizon. On June 6, 1944, that horizon would tell him everything. Miles inland, in a quiet corner of the Seine Valley, stood the chateau of La Roche-Guyon, a 12th century fortress built into the chalk cliffs above the river, restored over centuries into a country estate of the Rochefoucauld family. In the spring of 1944, it was the headquarters of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Army Group B. From its rooms, Rommel commanded the defense of the entire French coast, from the Netherlands down to the Loire. Farther east, in the western suburbs of Paris, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, sat the headquarters of Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, another chateau, another set of maps, another old man giving orders that his subordinates increasingly ignored. And far to the southeast, more than 1,000 kilometers from Normandy, high in the Bavarian Alps, sat the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat above the small town of Berchtesgaden, a house of stone and glass overlooking a landscape of pines and peaks. This was where the war was ultimately run. This was where the panzer reserves were locked. And this was where, on the night of June 5th, a man would take a sedative and go to sleep, and no one on his staff would dare wake him. Now consider the geography that shaped Germany's belief about where the invasion would come. Look at the map of the English Channel. Look at the narrowest point. That point is the Strait of Dover, and on the French side of it lies the Pas-de-Calais. 34 kilometers of open water separate the white cliffs of Dover from the beaches of Saint-Gatay. Compare that to Normandy, which lies more than 160 kilometers south, and the German assumption starts to make sense. Calais was closer. Calais was closer to the ports the Allies would need to keep an army fed, closer to the industrial heart of the Ruhr, closer to the airfields in England, closer to everything that mattered in a modern industrial war. The German 15th Army, the strongest and best equipped formation in the West, sat at the Pas-de-Calais waiting for an invasion that was never going to come. The German 7th Army, weaker, thinner, more spread out, sat in Normandy waiting for a threat that no one in the high command truly believed was there. The one armored formation with any real chance of reaching the invasion beaches in the first crucial hours was the 21st Panzer Division. It was stationed in and around the city of Caen, no more than a few dozen kilometers from the sea. Its commander was a 49-year-old officer named Edgar Feuchtinger, and on the night of June 5th, he would be nowhere near his command post. Tanks were fueled, his crews were trained, and when the moment came, he would not be allowed to move. Because the German Panzer Command structure had been deliberately, systematically, catastrophically fractured. This is the twist that shapes everything that follows in the story of the beaches. Hitler had refused to choose between Rommel and Rundstedt. Rommel wanted the tanks forward, at the water's edge, ready to strike in the first hours. Rundstedt wanted them held back, in deep reserve, to strike a decisive blow after the enemy had shown his hand. Hitler, incapable of making a hard choice between two competent professionals, had done what he always did in such situations. He had split the difference. He had given each man a piece of what he wanted, and in so doing, he had ensured that neither man could act decisively when the moment came. Some panzer divisions were forward, under Rommel's control. Others were back, under Rundstedt's. And the most powerful reserves of all, Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division, sat in central France under the direct control of the Wehrmacht High Command, which meant, in practice, that they could not move without Hitler's personal signature. Not Rommel's signature, not Rundstedt's signature. Hitler's, a single old man, asleep in a mountain house, with the fate of an armored counterattack in the hollow of his hand. There is one more piece of geography you have to understand. It is not on any map. It is in the atmosphere itself. Weather. The English Channel in early June 1944 was ugly. A storm had rolled in from the Atlantic, whipping up seas that made an amphibious landing look impossible. The German Meteorological Service, working with the limited data it had left after Allied naval and air operations, had systematically eliminated its long-range weather stations in the Atlantic and Greenland, made its forecast on the 4th of June, and delivered it up the chain. No invasion was possible, not for another week at minimum, probably 2. That forecast was based on real data, analyzed by real professionals, using the best information available to them. And it was completely, catastrophically wrong. Not because the meteorologists had failed, because the Allies had spent 4 years hunting down and destroying every source of upstream weather data in the North Atlantic. The Germans could not see the weather coming. They could only see the weather that was already on top of them. The Allies could see farther. British and American meteorologists, led by a Scottish scientist named James Stagg, who served as chief meteorological officer to General Eisenhower, had access to data from ships, from submarines, from weather stations in Iceland and Greenland that the Germans no longer controlled. And James Stagg, on the night of June 4th, had seen something the Germans could not see: a break in the weather. 36 hours of it. A narrow window opening on the morning of June 6th. Same sky, 2 different forecasts. One army stood down, the other army sailed. By the evening of June 5th, along the 80 kilometers of Normandy coast that were about to become the most consequential real estate on Earth, the Germans were in exactly the wrong posture. The strongest army was in the wrong place. The best panzer commander was on the wrong side of the border. The strategic armored reserve was locked behind a signature that could only be delivered by a sleeping man 1,000 kilometers to the east. The intelligence chain was still convinced the invasion was coming somewhere else. And the Weather Service had just told everyone up and down the chain that they could stand down. They stood down. And out on the water, in the darkness of the last few hours of June 5th, the largest amphibious force ever assembled in the history of warfare turned its bows toward the Normandy coast and began to move. The first thing to know about the night of June 5th, 1944, is that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not there. He had not been there for 2 days. On the morning of June 4th, roughly 48 hours before the invasion, Rommel had climbed into his Horch staff car outside the chateau at La Roche-Guyon and begun the long drive east. His route would take him across occupied France, through Reims, into Germany, and eventually to his home in the small town of Herrlingen in the Swabian hills near the city of Ulm. On the seat beside him sat a small package. Inside the package was a pair of women's shoes, gray suede, size 5.5. He had bought them in Paris. The shoes were for his wife. Her name was Lucy Rommel. She had been his wife since 1916. Her birthday fell on the 6th of June. Her husband had decided, based on the weather report, based on the calm assessment of the German Meteorological Service, based on his own experienced judgment, that no reasonable enemy would attempt an amphibious landing in the seas that were currently pounding the Norman coast, that he could safely leave his post for a few days. He would drive home. He would give his wife her shoes. He would spend birthday with her. Then, on the way back, he would stop at the Berghof and personally lobby Adolf Hitler for more panzer divisions. By the evening of June 5th, he was in Herrlingen, in the garden, walking with Lucy in the summer twilight. The shoes were still in their box. 600 miles to the west, at a small village called Tourcoing, on the Belgian border, a middle-aged intelligence officer named Helmuth Meyer was preparing for another night shift. Meyer's radio interception unit had been listening for months for a specific signal. 2 lines of French poetry. The first 2 lines of a poem by the 19th century poet Paul Verlaine, called Chanson d'Athènes. The Allies used those lines, broadcast over the BBC as coded messages to the French resistance to indicate the timing of the coming invasion. The first line, about the long sobs of autumn violins, meant an invasion within 2 weeks. The second line, about wounding the heart with monotonous languor, meant an invasion within 48 hours. At 9:15 on the evening of June 5th, Meyer heard the second line. He understood exactly what it meant. He alerted his own headquarters. The 15th Army, spread out along the Pas-de-Calais, went to full alert. The 7th Army, defending the beaches that were actually about to be invaded, was informed. And the 7th Army's response was measured, cautious, professional. The weather was still bad. The Meteorological Service was still standing by its forecast. Perhaps a few units would go to heightened readiness, but nothing more. Not yet. Here is the first twist of the night. Meyer had done his job perfectly. The system had received his warning. The system had chosen not to act on it, not because anyone was incompetent, not because anyone was asleep, because the entire German command in the West had spent 4 years being told, by its own intelligence, by its own analysts, by its own logic, that the real invasion would come at Calais. When the correct signal arrived, the filter caught it and softened it. Everyone heard the signal. Nobody dared believe it. At 16 minutes past midnight on the morning of June 6th, in a farmyard next to a small bridge over the Caen Canal in eastern Normandy, 3 British Horsa gliders came skidding out of the darkness and slammed into the earth 20 yards from their target. Out of them poured a company of British paratroopers under the command of a 31-year-old major named John Howard. Within 10 minutes, they had taken the bridge. It would later be called Pegasus Bridge, and it would go into the history books as the first Allied objective of D-Day. At almost the same moment, all across the Cotentin Peninsula to the west, thousands of American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into the darkness. Many of them landed miles from their intended drop zones. Scattered across the Norman countryside in the confusion of clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and inexperienced pilots. Along with them fell hundreds of small parachute-equipped dummies, 600 of them, code-named Ruperts, dropped as part of a deception operation called Titanic. The dummies were rigged with small explosive charges that simulated the sounds of a firefight when they landed. German telephone lines lit up. Confused reports flooded in from a dozen directions. Paratroopers here. Paratroopers there. Explosions in the fields. Small firefights that ended as quickly as they began. It was almost impossible for any officer in the chain to piece together what was real and what was noise. At 11 minutes past 1 o'clock in the morning, General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, telephoned Army Group B headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. On the line at the other end was General Hans Speidel, 46 years old, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rommel, currently standing in for his absent commander. Pemsel was direct. Based on his own read of the incoming reports, he told Speidel plainly, this was the large-scale operation. Speidel listened. Speidel disagreed. In his own assessment, the airborne drops were probably a raid, or perhaps a diversionary operation, the opening act of a larger deception, with the real invasion still to come, probably at Calais, probably within days. He told Pemsel to wait and see. Wait and see. Somewhere in the darkness of the Cotentin, a 19-year-old paratrooper was hanging from a church steeple in the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, playing dead while German soldiers ran past below him. Somewhere in a hedgerow near Ranville, a British corporal was bleeding out into the summer grass. Somewhere off the coast, 7,000 ships were closing on the beaches. And in a chateau on the Seine, a chief of staff was telling a chief of staff to wait and see. Here is the second twist. That same morning, June 6, 1944, General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, had scheduled a formal command post exercise for his senior officers. The location was Rennes, in Brittany, more than 150 kilometers south of the Normandy beaches. The scenario, by pure coincidence, was an Allied amphibious landing in Normandy. Several of his divisional and corps commanders had already left their posts and were on the roads to Rennes when the airborne drops began. They were rehearsing D-Day on the morning of D-Day. They had to turn their cars around in the dark and drive back through a Norman countryside that was already coming under attack to reach commands that were already fighting the battle they had been on their way to simulate. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Army Corps, the man whose 53rd birthday was now dawning across the fields of France, was among those turning back. He reached his headquarters at Saint-Lô before dawn. He looked at the situation map. He did not wait and see. He began issuing orders immediately. He wanted the 21st Panzer Division moving toward the beaches. Now, in the dark, before the sun came up, before the Allied fighter bombers took to the sky and made every road in Normandy a killing zone, 21st Panzer could not move. Because the 21st Panzer answered to Army Group B, which was Rommel, who was in Herrlingen. And every request had to pass through Speidel. And Speidel was still saying, wait and see. The one armored formation that might have disrupted the Allied airborne divisions while they were still scattered and disorganized in the dark fields of Normandy sat idling in its assembly area while the officers commanding it listened to the sound of aircraft and explosions rolling across the countryside. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours, the Chief of Staff of Obi West, the German High Command in the West, General Gunther Blumentritt, called Wehrmacht High Command. He wanted release of the Strategic Reserve, Panzerlehr, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the tanks that could turn the tide. At the other end of the line was General Alfred Jodl, 54 years old, Chief of the Operations Staff of the Wehrmacht High Command. Jodl considered the request. Jodl declined the request. The panzers could not move, he said, without the Führer's personal authorization. Blumentritt pointed out, reasonably, that the Führer could give that authorization if woken. Jodl replied with a sentence that would follow him in one form or another to the gallows at Nuremberg 2 years later. The Führer, he said, was asleep. The exact wording of that exchange, the exact hour it happened, and even which German officer said which sentence in which telephone call has been debated by historians for 80 years. What is not debated is the substance. Somewhere in the German High Command that morning, the men holding the authority to release the Strategic Panzer Reserve chose not to wake the one man whose signature was required to release it. And by the time he was finally woken, it was already too late. At Widerstandsnest 59, above the eastern end of Omaha Beach, in the pale gray light that was neither night nor day, Werner Pluskat raised his binoculars. The mist was thinning. The sea was still choppy from the storm that everyone had been so sure would make an invasion impossible. And through the mist, ships were appearing. Ships of every size and description. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, transport ships, ships that had not been there an hour ago, ships that filled the entire horizon from one end of the beach to the other. Ships that, by any calculation, Pluscat had ever been asked to make could not exist in the numbers his eyes were reporting. Dared. He picked up the telephone. He called his divisional headquarters. He said there were at least 10,000 ships out there. The voice on the other end of the line, a duty officer whose name has been lost to history, told him plainly that the Americans and the British did not have 10,000 ships. Nobody had 10,000 ships. Was he certain of what he was seeing? Where, the voice asked, were they heading? Pluscat gave his answer. It has passed into the permanent record of the Second World War. Straight for me, he said. There is a twist embedded in this story that most tellings will not tell you. The account of Pluscat's dawn sighting, the version that made it into Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day, in 1959, the version that made it into the film in 1962, with Pluscat himself serving as a consultant on the production, has been challenged in the decades since. A German machine gunner named Heinrich Severloh, who served in the neighboring bunker at Widerstandsnest 62 that same morning, wrote in his own memoir, published in the year 2000, that Pluscat was not with his unit on the day of the invasion. Severloh claimed that Lieutenant Firking, the artillery observer at WN62, tried repeatedly to reach Pluscat by telephone that morning, and that Pluscat could not be found. The story of the phone call may be real. The story may be embellished. The story may, in some of its details, have been polished by a war correspondent working with a source who had good reason to want to remember himself well. But something happened on that horizon that morning. Some German officer somewhere above Omaha Beach picked up his binoculars, saw the fleet, called it in, and was told, in effect, that what he was reporting was impossible, because it was not just Pluscat. All along the coast, in observation posts from the base of the Cotentin to the mouth of the Orne, German forward observers were seeing the same thing. Multiple sources, independent positions, reports climbing the same chain and meeting the same filter. This cannot be the main invasion. This cannot be the scale being described. Something must be wrong. The fleet was real. The filter was not built to see it. At 6:30 in the morning, the first American landing craft dropped their ramps at Omaha Beach. 27 of the 32 amphibious Sherman tanks that were supposed to give the assault infantry armored support had already flooded and sunk in the choppy seas well short of the beach. Their crews died inside them. The infantry waded ashore through chest-deep water, carrying 60 or more pounds of equipment into the fire of the most effectively positioned defensive line on the entire invasion coast. The German 352nd Infantry Division, the division that appeared on no Allied intelligence map, did exactly what it had trained for. Its machine guns opened up. Its pre-registered artillery began falling on the beach. Its riflemen fired down from the bluffs into men who had not yet reached solid ground. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed at the Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach. Within roughly 10 minutes, Company A ceased to exist as a functioning combat unit. 5 of its 6 landing craft dropped their ramps directly in front of German machine gun positions. The men in the first ranks did not make it out of the water. The men behind them died on top of the men in front of them. For those first 2 hours, if you had been sitting in one of the German bunkers looking down at what was happening on the sand below, you would have believed the defense was holding. You would have been right in that moment. You would have been wrong about what was coming next. Because out on the water, watching the slaughter from the decks of the destroyers stationed just offshore, a small group of American naval officers were about to make a decision that no doctrine had authorized, no operations order had anticipated, and that would, in the space of a few hours, systematically dismantle the defensive positions their planned bombardment had failed to touch. Ships like the USS Frankfurt and the USS Carmack and the USS McCook and the USS Harding closed on the beach at ranges that no naval gunnery training had ever prepared them for. Some of them steamed to within 800 yards of the sand. Some of them scraped their keels on the sandbars. Their gunnery officers picked out individual German pillboxes by eye and fired their 5-inch guns over open sights, the way a rifleman would take aim at a man in a window. It was not in the plan. It was men looking at what was happening on that beach and deciding to act anyway. And that improvised, unauthorized, close-range naval gunfire, repeated by multiple destroyers along the Omaha sector through the middle of the morning, began methodically tearing apart the fortifications that had held the American assault at the water's edge. By mid-morning, the 21st Panzer Division had finally received authorization to move, hours too late, straight into a sky that Allied air power now owned completely. The Luftwaffe, which Hermann Göring had personally promised would contest any invasion, flew roughly 319 sorties over the whole of Normandy on June 6th. Allied air forces flew approximately 14,600, 46 to 1, not a gap, a chasm. Somewhere around 10:15 in the morning, in the village of Herrlingen in the Swabian Hills of Germany, a telephone rang. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel picked it up. General Speidel was on the other end. Speidel had finally been able to reach him. The invasion had begun. It was almost certainly the main invasion. Rommel needed to return. Rommel put down the phone. He climbed into his staff car. He began the long drive back to France. Hours on that drive? According to his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, who sat beside him in the car, Rommel said almost nothing. When he spoke, he repeated the same two words over and over in the flat voice of a man reciting a sentence for a judge. How stupid of me! How stupid of me! He had said for months that the first 24 hours would decide the battle. He had spent them driving. Adolf Hitler woke sometime around noon. He was briefed, over lunch, on the situation in Normandy. He listened. He nodded. He remained convinced, in the face of every piece of evidence now flowing into the Berghof, that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real invasion, he told his generals, was still to come, probably at Calais, probably within days. He did not release the Panzer reserves until sometime around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Allied beachhead at Normandy was 10 hours old. The morning tide had come and gone. Reinforcements were streaming ashore across all 5 beaches. The airfields the Allies would need to sustain a campaign were already being surveyed by engineers. The window that Rommel himself had identified, the first 24 hours, the longest day, was closing hour by hour. When the order finally came down, Panzerlehr Division, commanded by a 45-year-old veteran of the North African campaign named Fritz Bayerlein, began moving toward the coast in broad daylight. Bayerlein had served under Rommel in the desert. He knew what happened to armored columns caught on open roads with Allied fighter bombers overhead. He requested permission to move only at night. His request was denied. The situation, his superiors told him, was too urgent. His division took a full day to reach the front. On the roads leading into Normandy, under the constant hammer of American and British aircraft, Panzerlehr lost 5% of its combat strength before it fired a single round at an Allied soldier. Tanks burned in ditches. Trucks lay overturned in fields. Men who had survived the Russian winter died on French country roads because Adolf Hitler had slept in. 21st Panzer Division, the one armored formation that could have moved in the crucial first hours of the morning, finally launched its counterattack in the afternoon. It drove north toward the coast, between the British Gold Beach and the Canadian Juno Beach, aiming for the sea. For a few genuine hours, it threatened to split the Allied beachhead apart. A handful of German tanks actually reached the coast at a spot called Luc-sur-Mer and looked out over the water at the enormity of what was landing on the beaches to either side of them. Then Allied air power hit them. Then Allied naval guns hit them. Then their infantry support failed to arrive. And by evening, the 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored formation to attack anywhere on D-Day, had pulled back with nothing to show for the effort but casualty lists and burning tanks. It was the entire lesson of Rommel's doctrine, delivered in a single afternoon. Without air cover, without surprise, without being positioned in advance. An armored response to an already established beachhead was not a counterattack. Demonstration of how the war had changed while Adolf Hitler slept through it. By midnight on June 6th, the Allied position in Normandy was secure. Roughly 156,000 Allied troops had come ashore across the 5 beaches and the airborne drop zones. The cost had been roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. On Omaha alone, the beach where the 352nd Infantry Division had made the Americans pay more dearly than at any other landing that day. American losses ran close to 2,000 men. German casualties in the same division ran roughly 1,200, nearly a fifth of the division's total strength gone in a single day. At Utah, American forces had suffered fewer than 200 casualties against a far weaker static division. At Gold Juno and Sword, British and Canadian troops had pushed inland against defenders who lacked the strength and preparation of the 352nd. The fleet that Werner Pluskat had reported at dawn as 10,000 ships was still there that night. It would still be there in the morning, and it would keep unloading men and tanks and fuel and food, wave after wave, for weeks, with no German force left capable of interrupting it. 6 days after the invasion, on the 12th of June, General Erich Marx left his headquarters at St. Lo for a frontline inspection. 6 days after his 53rd birthday. 6 days after the morning on which he had done everything a corps commander could do to answer the invasion he had, for months, been almost alone in predicting. He was traveling near a village called Hebekrevan, northwest of St. Lo, when an Allied fighter bomber spotted his staff car. 20-millimeter round tore into his groin and severed his femoral artery. His driver got him out of the car and into a roadside ditch. There was nothing anyone could do. He bled to death by mid-morning. He had helped author the operational plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He had helped write the document that killed millions of people, including 2 of his own sons. He had served a criminal regime to the end, and in the final week of his life, in the small window in which his professional judgment mattered, he had been right about where the enemy would come, and he had been right about what to do when they did, and none of it had mattered because the system above him had already decided months earlier what it was allowed to hear. On the 17th of July, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was riding in his staff car near a village called Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery, in the hills south of the Normandy front. An Allied fighter bomber spotted him. Strafing run wounded his driver mortally and threw the car into a ditch. Rommel suffered severe head injuries. He was evacuated to Germany to recover. 3 days later, on the 20th of July, a small group of German army officers, led by a colonel named Klaus von Stauffenberg, attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler with a bomb at his headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb went off. Hitler survived. The purge that followed swept up thousands. Among those implicated on the thin edges of the conspiracy was General Hans Speidel, and through Speidel, the shadow of suspicion fell on Field Marshal Rommel. On the 14th of October, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They brought with them a small vial of cyanide and an offer from the Führer. Rommel could take the poison and be given a state funeral, and his family would be safe. Or he could stand trial before the People's Court, where the outcome was already decided, and his wife and his son Manfred would be left to whatever the regime chose to do to them. Took the poison. He was 52 years old. His son Manfred, who was 15 at the time, spent the rest of his life trying to reconstruct what had happened to his father in those last months. He would grow up to become mayor of Stuttgart. He would live until 2013. Lucy Rommel outlived her husband by 27 years. She never remarried. The gray suede shoes have not survived as far as anyone knows. At Nuremberg, in the years after the war, several of the men who sat in the German Caen on that morning faced trial for their roles in the crimes of the regime. Alfred Jodl, who told Blumentritt that the Führer was asleep, was found guilty and hanged in October of 1946. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, whose signature stood beside Jodel's on so many of the criminal orders of the war, was hanged the same day. Gerd von Rundstedt, the old field marshal at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, was captured by American forces in 1945 and held for 4 years. He was released in 1949 on grounds of ill health. He died in Hanover in 1953. Hans Speidel, who told Max Pemsel to wait and see, survived the war, survived the purge that followed the July 20th plot, and went on to serve as a general in the post-war West German Army. He became one of the founding commanders of NATO ground forces in Central Europe. He died in 1984. Werner Pluskat surrendered to American forces near Magdeburg on the 23rd of April, 1945, alongside Lieutenant General Kurt Dittmar. He spent time in captivity. He came home. In 1962, when Cornelius Ryan's book was adapted for film, Pluskat served as one of the military consultants on the production. He watched Hans Christian Blech play him on the screen. He stood on the bluff above Omaha Beach in 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the invasion, that he had been the first German officer to see the Allied fleet approaching that morning. Whether that claim was entirely true, or whether it grew in the telling, is a question historians are still arguing about. Pluskat died in Germany on the 11th of June, 2002, at the age of 89. He had lived for 58 years with the memory of one telephone call. This is where the story lands. Because the honest verdict on what happened in the German command posts of Normandy on June 6, 1944, is not really a story about failed soldiers. The men in the bunkers above Omaha Beach fought with skill and ferocity. The defense of that beach was, for 2 hours, genuinely successful. Werner Pluskat, whatever else may or may not be true about him that morning, made the call. General Marx, on his 53rd birthday, gave the orders. General Pemsel, at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning, told his superior in plain professional language that this was the large-scale operation. They were not wrong. They were just not heard. The Germans did not lose D-Day because their soldiers failed. They lost it because their system was built over 4 years to reject exactly the information it most needed to hear. A deception operation called Fortitude had convinced them the invasion was coming somewhere else. A meteorological service without upstream data had told them the weather forbade a landing. Command structure requiring a single old man's personal signature to move armored reserves had made that man unavailable at the 1 hour of the war when his signature mattered most. And a duty officer, on the receiving end of a telephone call at 5:15 in the morning, had asked, in effect, whether the man on the other end of the line had been drinking. Every piece of correct information reached the right place, in the right form, at the right time. Every piece of correct information met a filter that had been carefully, systematically, catastrophically constructed to hear only one particular answer. There is a lesson buried in this that has nothing to do with beaches or bunkers or the shape of a Norman coastline. It is a lesson about what happens to any large organization, in war or in peace, when it becomes structurally incapable of listening to the men at the edge who can actually see what is coming. It is a lesson about what happens when the chain of command requires a single point of decision, and that point of decision is asleep. It is a lesson about how systems die. The Germans did not lose D-Day because they lacked information. They lost it because they had built a system that could not act on the information it already had. Somewhere in the Swabian hills of Germany, in a small house in Herrlingen, on the morning of June 6, 1944, a woman named Lucy Rommel woke to find a small package waiting for her on a table. She opened it. Inside was a pair of gray suede shoes, size 5.5, chosen in a Paris shop by her husband, who had wanted, for once in a very long war, to be at home for her birthday. She would not know, until much later that day, what her husband had been away from. If your father or your grandfather served anywhere in the European theater during the Second World War, American, British, Canadian, French, or on any of the other sides that fought and bled in Normandy that summer, and if any piece of their story survives in a letter or a photograph or in the things they never quite talked about at the kitchen table, I would be honored to hear it in the comments. Because that is the part of this history that no official archive can ever fully replace.